y'all, and welcome back. My name is Jane Corley with PicVisions, Media Arts and Photography. If it's your first time here, welcome. Make sure to like this video if you learned something new, subscribe to my channel, and ring the bell so you can be notified every time a new video is uploaded every week. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about night photography and low light photography. I'm going to give you the 10 best tips for being successful with night photography and low light photography. Let's get started. Number one is have a tripod. I know I've talked about gear before, but you're going to need to have a tripod. It's a must, a monopod, big or small, just some sort of stabilization device when you're dealing with low light and night photography. The reason is because when it comes to taking photos out of your camera, any breath or slight camera shake is going to ruin that image. So to have a tripod or some sort of stabilization device, I have honestly a collection of rocks I use sometimes in my camera bag to prop up the lens of my camera if I'm trying to get a low angle or play with my perspective. Really just have something that you can stabilize your camera body on. And honestly, self-timer is going to be your best friend, because if you set your camera up, you can just set your self-timer and walk away and wait. That way, no body vibrations, no extra movement, even just the slightest movement when you get into the higher shutter speeds is going to ruin that photo. So my first tip, tripod. My second tip is manual focus. The reason why manual focus is so important in night photography and low light photography is because if you choose autofocus mode on your camera lens, it's going to put its version of what you should be focusing on in your camera. So if you're wanting to get a far off distance horizon, but you have a very large aperture, it's going to try to focus on something closer even after you hit your shutter button. So to take all the guesswork out of it, to get exactly the focus point you want in your image, choose manual focus. Go ahead and set your focus point before you do your shutter button, and you won't have any issues. My third tip is going to be ISO. How to manage your ISO for night photography and low light photography. When it comes to low light photography in a concert venue or in just an area where you don't have a lot of light to work with in an enclosed space, traditionally your ISO is going to be higher, more of the 3200 to 6400 range. But when it comes to night photography, you really want to keep it below 1600. The reason being is the higher the ISO is, the more noise, pixelation, blowout you're going to have in your image resolution. This is because the ISO translates to how much light can we physically grab from the image within each individual pixel. So in night photography, you're not going to want a lot of that pixelization, and honestly, if you have a lower ISO, you're really just going to get more of a smooth image. My fourth tip is to shoot in RAW. I know we haven't gone over RAW in any of my videos yet. It's coming up very, very soon, my fellow photographers. But shoot in RAW. Even if it's a RAW JPEG, a small format, just make sure you're in RAW. The reason being is that your RAW is not going to compress that image. And if you have to make any adjustments in post-production to the exposure, just bump it up a little bit, maybe decrease your shadows and your highlights, you're going to be able to do that with a RAW image the way that you're not going to be able to do that with a JPEG image. Number 5 is going to be test shots. Especially when you're first starting out and you're still trying to find out the comparison and the relationship between aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, test shoot your images. Not only will it be an enormous learning experience, but you may get that perfect photo in your first few test shots and rock it. What I mean by test shots is going to be start off with a very wide open aperture, so something a little bit lower depth of field in order to acquire as much light as possible. Start with a low shutter speed, so maybe 1/2 of a second, maybe even a whole second, and grow from there. So if you want a little bit more of the depth of field, increase your aperture, making it a smaller hole for light to come through in your lens, and then slow down your shutter speed to maybe that 1 second or the 1/2 of a second. Because the relationship between your aperture, how open or closed the opening in your lens is, the f-stop, whatever you want to call it, it's the aperture, and the shutter speed, how long your shutter is open, that's also going to translate how much light comes through your lens. And then the balance of adding that ISO element for how pixelated, not pixelated, or sensitive those sensors in your camera are, that's going to create that image. So let's take a look at this cave image I have here. This cave was pitch black. It's one of those caves in, I think it was in maybe North Carolina. We were going on a holiday trip, and you walk in this cave and maybe 20-30 feet inside of this cave is pitch black. So I said, oh yes, y'all, I want to see if I can get all of these nooks and crannies and all the good stuff. So imagine this being pitch black, y'all. Having a 20-second exposure time, 20-second shutter speed with a larger aperture number, because I knew I wanted as much detail as possible. So to compromise, I had that really small aperture opening at f32. Then I had a 20-second exposure time, allowing my camera to be open, accepting all the light possible for 20 whole seconds. Yes, I had to have a tripod. Yes, I had to do my self-timer, but it came out awesome. Then I was able to take this into post-production, because I shot it in RAW, and bump up those shadows in a few areas and bring down those highlights where they might have been blown out, and really just structure the image to be this cave tunnel that I wanted. So make sure to do your test shots, because this was probably the 10th, 11th, or 12th photo that I took in this area, because I said, Jane, there is no way that I need 20 seconds worth of exposure in this cave. No way. There's got to be light coming from somewhere. There's water kind of down these caves. I got to get some reflection. Do your test shots, because especially in the digital world we live in, you can just delete it if it looks like garbage. But having these test shots will really make it so you can see what these different relationships between the aperture and the shutter speed do for each other. My sixth tip is going to be Aperture Priority Mode. If you're really still not comfortable on manual mode, shoot in Aperture Priority. Make aperture adjustments to your depth of field and let your camera make the adjustments to your shutter speed that it needs. It might still be a little over or underexposed, but you can at least see the settings that your camera suggests that you make within that image. And then tweak here and there, make the adjustments you need, but start off on Aperture Priority Mode so that you can see what the relationship that your camera suggests that you make before you jump into full manual. So one little sidebar I want to put in this category is going to be the manipulation of light, because that's really what photography is all about, painting with light or the manipulation of light. So if you have, let's say, a city street, this city street is going to have a bunch of moving cars and maybe people walking around, but you're also going to have these static buildings, static bridges and streets. So if you point your camera at this cityscape and all the cars are rushing by, but these buildings, majestic buildings, are staying static, that longer exposure is going to give you these crispy buildings and just beautiful colors and tones. The night sky is going to be lit up with all the colors from the city, because that's light that's provided by the environment that you're shooting. But the cars, the people, all of the moving factors of this image are going to be blurred. So it's going to create light streaks. Similar to the way, and I'm sure you guys have probably seen it before, when people have like 4th of July or on New Year's celebrations with sparklers, drawing the New Year number with sparklers. That's what this is. This is a longer, open exposure photograph. So pitch black in the backyard, y'all. Somebody takes a sparkler and writes 2020 for New Year's coming up. 2020, by drawing it with those sparklers, will remain an imprint on that image even though that person is no longer standing behind it, because that area has been exposed to light within the imprint of your image. So if you remember the rules of stop and moving motion, that a shorter shutter speed, so 1/30 or 1/60, a quick shutter speed is going to give you stop motion. 30 second, 20 second, 10 second, even 5 seconds is going to give you blurred motion in your image. So moving water, that kind of thing in the daytime, well, you can also do that kind of thing at nighttime and produce light streaks. Here's a little extra tip before I move on to my next section. So when you're shooting the night sky, like you saw in our very first picture at the very beginning of this video, the stars in the sky are very susceptible to streaking. So they'll all look like shooting stars. The reason is because the earth is moving under our feet. We are turning on a big blue and green planet, y'all. So do not forget that you yourself are moving on a planet when you are shooting something up in the sky, because the sky is static and you are in motion. Yes, I know that the earth does not move too fast, but play around with it, y'all, and you will see that even a 5, 10, 15, 20 second exposure, you're going to get a little bit more of that streaking. It's not going to be that drastic until you get between 15 and 30 seconds where you'll start seeing that extensive streaking. Let's move on to our next tip. Number 7, bulb mode is when you can push your shutter button down for literally as long as you want or as short as you want. So if you're shooting an open field with a lot of light coming from behind it, maybe by street lights or from cars passing through the field, and you really want to gain all of the information in the middle of the photo as you can, but you can't quite get it at 1 second, and you can't quite get it at 2 seconds, you can push your shutter down and do your own shutter, because your bulb mode is going to allow this finger right here to differentiate what your shutter speed is going to be, rather than setting it to a predetermined shutter speed within your camera. This really doesn't come in handy, in my opinion, unless you are doing things that are longer than the exposure settings possible within your camera. So traditionally, most standard cameras have about 30-second exposure time, which is a max. So if you're wanting a full minute, if you're wanting a full 5 minutes, 10 minutes, long exposure time for some reason, you're going to need to use bulb mode. So look into it and get familiar with bulb mode. Number 8, I touched on it before, which is set your timer. If you are in an environment that is really windy, in an environment that you don't really have a lot of stabilization, set your tripod up, get your settings the way you want to do them, then set your timer. That way you can push your shutter and walk away. So you don't have to worry about body shape, you don't have to worry about anything that your human body would do to mess up that image. When you have longer exposures, anything over 1/60th of a second, y'all, 1/60th of a second, any slight shake, even so small, is going to mess up your image. And trust me, it's going to frustrate you because you think, I don't even move anywhere and I'm solid. You are not solid. You think you're solid, but the breath you breathe into your body is what makes you shake. Even a little bit of a shaky in your hands will mess up your image. Your camera is so sensitive to the movement and the different imprints that you're putting onto your image that if you move at all, even just a little bit, that image is going to come out blurred when you get up to the longer shutter speeds. Number 9, which is a really fun one to play with once you get past the initial intro to night and low light photography, is to add your own light. If you need a shorter shutter speed and want a wide open aperture and you can't quite get it exactly the way you want to have it look, you can add your own light. So You can bring extra studio lights if you want to give a little bit more light to your situation, but I think it's a little bit more fun to add your own sporadic light. If you're shooting an area where there's not really a lot of light, maybe you get a lot of light from underneath, like in this image you see here, but you need more. I actually had my now husband shine a flashlight onto this grill briefly. I'm talking, it was maybe a 1/30 exposure, and all he did was shwink, added a little bit of light, like a little dip, a little taste of light. This added texture and the ability to see the beauty on these steaks and really just get those coals underneath. By adding that little extra bit of light, it steps up the exposure of the image. Now, why is this? Back in the day when people were using film all the time, it was the only standard, they had these large enlargers. It's literally called an enlarger, and people would take their little film and put it in the top of their enlarger and expose that image onto a light sensitive material like photo paper. While this exposure process was being done, they had to calculate how much time that light was exposed through that negative to go onto that light sensitive material. Well, sometimes it would be too much light, so their image would be too dark. Sometimes it wouldn't be enough light, so they wouldn't have enough contrast and enough information in their photo for it to make sense. So what they would do in areas of that photo where they would get too much light, they would actually do what's called a dodge, and they would use little paddles that were of certain shapes to dodge the light in that area. If they needed to burn more light in that area, what they would do is they would actually do a second exposure of that film through and the enlarger and to that light sensitive material, and they would physically cover up the areas that they didn't want to put more light on so that they could burn more light into the areas that needed more light. So add your own light is really just another way to expose the image a little further in certain areas so that you get more contrast, textures, and content in the areas where you want textures, content, and structure. My final thought, number 10, is going to be understand the light that you already have in your image. So if you're in a concert hall, you've got light shining down on the stage, that's light that you have in that image to work with. If you are in a downtown area and you've got a bunch of the lights coming through the buildings, you've got a bunch of street lights, you've got people even on their phones on the street, that is light, y'all. That is light that you can use to make adjustments to your exposure so that you don't have to have a slower shutter speed in order to get light. You can open that aperture to a lower depth of field if you would like, or even make it smaller if you would like. In some of these pictures where you've seen fire, that fire was a light source. That fire allowed us to take that picture and get as much content as possible with a quicker shutter speed because we had more light in that little area. The golden rule for night photography and indoor low light photography is to play with your aperture and your shutter speed. The lower number your aperture is, that allows more light. The smaller the opening, the less light. Shutter speed, the faster the shutter speed, the less time light has to be exposed. The longer shutter speed, the longer that image has time to be exposed. More light versus less light. Also pay attention to light that is not in your frame. If you have light coming from behind you, that's light you have to work with. That's like having a big studio lamp behind you in order to help expose the image in front of you. You can set up small car lights or little halogen lights or whatever you have outside of your frame. Even though that light is not in your image, that light is still contributing to your image. That is still light within the environment of where you are shooting. So pay attention to those elements around, experiment with your aperture and shutter speed, play around with night photography and low light photography. It really is fun. There's so many things that you can do in night photography and low light photography that you really just cannot do during the day because you have light from the sun messing everything up. So I hope this video was helpful on night photography and how to shoot in low light photography. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section below. Also, I'd love to see your work. I'd love to see what you guys are doing with night photography and low light photography and how you're adjusting light and aperture and shutter speed. And I'm so excited to see your work, so please share it below. Until next time, Jane Corley, Pick Visions, Media Arts and Photography. Make sure to like this video if you learned something new. Subscribe to my channel and ring the bell so you can be notified every time a new video is uploaded every week. See you later, guys.